Hi, I'm Eric with Event Store. As event sourcing grows in popularity, developers, architects, and anyone of any decision making capability are wondering what its true benefits and viability are. Specifically, two questions come to mind, and this is something that you likely ask yourself when you learn any new technology, technique, paradigm, programming language, what have you. And that's when should one use it? And when should one, possibly more importantly, not use it? So, we're going to cover how this exciting, I think, data storage technique that we call event sourcing compares to the traditional methodologies that, if you're watching this video, you likely already know. So, welcome. We're going to cover those differences and how they really produce a different mental model and a different approach than you're used to, and unlock, so to speak, benefits that you may not be aware of, even if you already have an event sourced application in production, even if you're already using an event sourcing database like Event Store DB. So, we're going to hit those wins and when not scenarios, things you might not be aware of, and hopefully clarify quite a few things. Now, this video is not why event sourcing, though that will shine through, but specifically for that topic, we have a video called Why Event Sourcing by Stephen Tung, and we'll provide a link to that. So please take a second to get comfortable, perhaps grab a drink, and let's kick this discussion off. Let's go over a few quick disclaimers just to set the stage and level expectations. Event sourcing, or anything new or that you're expanding your knowledge of, is not a silver bullet. Yes, you should hopefully get more familiar with it, practice it, learn about when and when not situations, which is why we're here. You should certainly challenge yourself when you're learning something, but just be careful. And like anything else, is not a silver bullet. That would be nice if it was, sure. And it's also not a golden hammer. Don't treat all your problems and use cases and situations as nails. You're gonna break your fingers. Keep your fingers nice and intact. You got to use that keyboard or whatever tool you used to code. So that's just a reminder. It's going to be said again, but we're going to hopefully unlock some new ideas and benefits that people typically don't realize, and that's very exciting. So let's get going. To be able to answer when is event sourcing not viable, not a good fit, and when it shouldn't be used, we need to take a step back and ask a few questions. So we have a pop quiz. There's no need to email me your answers or leave them in the comments section, though. Maybe that would be entertaining if you did. But when did you first experience or learn how to use a relational database? When did you learn to use SQL, structure queried language? And when did you first encounter a spreadsheet application like Microsoft Excel, Google Sheets, or Lotus 123? Because for many of us, we've been using those programs in particular for maybe decades. Maybe we learned them in primary school and elementary when we were learning to type because educators knew that computers were going to take over the world, as they inevitably will, and that we're likely going to need to know how these things work, either because we'll use them daily or they're going to be referenced a lot. So, being able to take data, as nebulous as it may be, and splice it and cut it up and put it into giant matrices, tables, spreadsheets, for many of us is like second nature. I bet if you're watching this video, you could look at any programming language where there is a data entity, and you probably could almost 100% figure out how it's going to live inside of a relational database. That's just something we're used to. That is the mental model we have honed over the years. And that's really what I'm referring to when talking about the traditional data modeling techniques in traditional databases. It's that mental model, knowing how it's going to look like, how it's going to be used. So I do want to take a second here, and that if you are in an organization that lives off a spreadsheet, either because you're deriving data from it or it's being projected to a spreadsheet that the executives use to make executive decisions, I want you to know that you're welcomed here. You're seen, you're recognized. It's going to be okay. So Let's go ahead and focus now on when is event sourcing perhaps not the best solution. Now that we've realized that many of us really have only had one mental model when it comes to handling and working with data, and it's been well honed, we've known of these techniques for a very long time. Let's talk about when event sourcing is not a good fit, when you should just use those tried and true methodologies, you know, use create, read, update, delete, CRUD, because that is what works best. So, one question that I learned from a mentor of sorts a few years ago, and this is something that should be asked right away because it's going to lead to some good follow up questions and discussion is the module of code where event sourcing is going to be used considered either core or supportive? Now, by core, we're referring to it being essential to making decisions for business operations, where the data is likely to be referenced many times. It's going to be part of an aggregation or maybe many aggregations, and it could have analytics applied to it and be of benefit. So that isn't to say, hey, the data science team is ready to analyze it. Maybe your organization isn't at that point, but if it is data that theoretically could be analyzed, because when you have a proper event sourced system using a proper event store database like event store DB, have to mention it, uh, and you're not worrying about something like a retention period with your data, and if you're able to build a report saying, hey, how did this thing trend over the last few weeks or months or years? Because you can do that, that is a good fit for event sourcing. But if your module of code that's responsible for this data is more supportive, where things are more one and done or single purpose, and here's another great question to ask if you believe it is more of a supportive role, is this module of code, this application, this service, is it going to be treated as a bag of data? Now, not saying can it be, but will it? So this is why you should be collaborating with your end users and your domain subject matter experts to know how it's going to be leveraged. So let's give some more specific examples. Stop beating around the bush. So one example that I like to use is content management systems. Now, is it nice to know when something was last changed and by who? Sure. And you can have fields in a relational database or properties in a document store for that. But when you're thinking about something like a blog, primarily the main article entry, and maybe it needs to be changed because of grammatical errors or typos that need to be addressed and fixed, is anyone really caring about the difference, that evolution? Oh, yeah, they had to make a fix, but the actual value itself, is that being leveraged? Probably not. Another example is media. When you're storing audio, image, video, that isn't to say there are use cases out there that I've heard about where they're using event sourcing as some sort of analysis tool. But that's, again, more on the analysis side, which is a great, again, way to kind of think about things. But if you're just storing it, again, thinking of a content management system, maybe there's a wiki like image or someone's avatar as part of their user profile. Those, great. If they need to be updated, then they're updated. You override what we like to call the current state. Great, just update it. We don't need to know the story or the evolution of that. So those are some great questions that I've leveraged and I've learned from my forebearers. So if you think of something as either core or supportive, you typically get an answer that you can run with. Now, before we dive into when event sourcing is clearly viable, value bringing, beneficial, and stereotypical industries it's used in, I just want to take, again, a step back, pump the brakes a little bit, and make sure that we realize that event sourcing itself, the data storage technique, it's not a system wide architecture. It's not something that is applied to everything and should not be applied to everything. It's tricky words because not everything needs to be captured in that granular, time specific way. Some things just aren't, as we just covered, and it's okay for those things to live side by side. And perhaps even more so, if you're new to event sourcing, you're new to this paradigm, can you imagine trying to build a fleet of services or a system and have everything work that way? So, combined with everything working that way and some things clearly not lending themselves well to this data storage technique, where when really you should just create, read, update, or delete certain things that are more simple and you don't need to know the evolution of or apply analysis. Man, so that's just something to remember. So let's go ahead and talk about when event sourcing is ideal. Okay, so when do we use event sourcing? Well, I have two concise, small, sassy, cheeky answers. The first is if you made it through the when not questions, congratulations. Maybe you have a good opportunity to use event sourcing. The second is if you were to go to your search engine of choice, type in when and where to use event sourcing, and maybe append the word blog or article, you're going to find things, and I'm a little guilty of this in the past as well, that just list out industries and job functions that historically use ledgers. Okay, that's not untrue. Things like the financial industry, transport, gambling, those are all historically, they have a list that can't be changed by anyone once it's written, just to account for everything. Um, that's it's again not untrue. Okay, but there is so many more opportunities and ways to use event sourcing, because really event sourcing is about capturing intent. And that's important for, I would say, any industry, any job, any function. To what degree, that's, that can be under debate. But if you need to capture intent, have this metadata, it's nice and granular and can be leveraged in multiple ways, and you're not don't want to overwrite the state in, let's say, a relational database. That way you have some history and can learn from mistakes or changes. Event sourcing is going to be very, very appealing and can likely bring a lot of value. So let's talk about that. As we discussed in the when not to use event sourcing segment of this video, being able to ask the right questions early on can really help yield answers and help drive further discussion that will impact your decision on if, when, and where to use event sourcing. So I recommend that if you do have a high value bearing opportunity in front of you with what you know about event sourcing, go ahead and ask rather, this question. Does this software module need to capture intent? An anecdote. When I was a software engineering consultant, I brought this very question up with a new client during the discovery phase of this project. So when we were talking with the CTO early on, he's told me that the business should always be capturing the intent behind the data, because the data was their biggest asset, and they should always be able to answer the why behind every decision made. And that just, ooh, he was speaking to my heart. I didn't disagree with any of it then. I don't now. He absolutely nailed it, whether he knows it or not. Um, so that mentality is actually why I personally think event sourcing should be more widely applied than it currently is, and not just limited to the industries it stereotypically traditionally has been tied to. Now, thankfully, again, curiosity is growing. We're seeing more folks interested in taking this event sourcing approach and using purpose-driven products like Event Store DB, and that's great because data is one of, if not the biggest asset for many organizations. I personally have had the technology leaders in organizations I've belonged to say that, and it's very reassuring to hear that, honestly. So honestly, it's time developers, engineers, architects, and other decision makers treat it like it is. Honestly, I just had to get that off my chest. All right. Okay. So when we're writing, crafting, and extending and maintaining these repositories of code that really power and fuel and run these core business functions, we should know what's going on. We should have the context of the decisions being made and recorded. And that doesn't matter if these decisions are, you know, in a small if block of code, or something like where a user needs to be involved and needs to manually perform an action, like a bank officer approving a small business's loan, or perhaps an underwriter approving and advancing a mortgage to its next stage. These are effectively milestones. They should be captured. There should be good context. They explain the story that's being recorded in the streams of events, right? They should tell a story at the end of the day. So if you're responsible for the software that supports these business functions, you really do have an opportunity to use event sourcing. It's just not tied to those stereotypes that we discussed. So now what? You can now confidently answer why and when and where your data is coming from, the decisions made. The data itself is richer and a bit more granular than you would ever get with CRUD. But how is it being leveraged? When will it be leveraged? And by whom? So we're going to get to that. I think it may be the most important part of event sourcing, or at least leveraging event sourcing. But the next question to lead to that isn't for you to answer. It's for you to ask the business or individuals that your software and your team support. It may even be another software team, right? They are downstream of you, they're adjacent, and they are reliant, dependent on the information that you are sending their way. They need that. You have a pipeline going of sorts. So let's imagine that's the case, because it's not uncommon. And that was actually my first exposure to event sourcing, is being able to feed all this data, meaningful data, aggregated data, to the next team so they could do their job. This team that relies on you, that needs the data possibly in certain shapes and formats, protocols, what have you, because of their downstream partner, their constraints that they have. I know in my experience of e-commerce, we had to use a lot of the same data, but make it available in XML, JSON, GraphQL. I'm missing one. It's probably for the better. And then some of it would be a little bit different depending on who it needed to go to. So we literally had dozens of different shapes of very similar data, but different, dozens and dozens of different shapes needing to be produced, different read models. For those that are experienced event sourcing practitioners, you probably know where I'm going here. And that is, again, what I and others consider event sourcing's probably most killer feature, and that's projections. So when you record facts of what have happened, this undisputed, granular, context-rich data that we've talked about quite a bit on the right side of your application, you're able to really record that who, what, when, and where type stuff, depending on your industry. But you have effectively a large sequence of facts, right? A ledger, as we've talked about. And when you need that data to be presented in a particular way, like with a downstream partner who has their own constraints or what have you, you can take those facts, excuse me, you can take those facts, you can correlate them, and you can effectively build an interpretation of something that's happened, like a certain perspective, which is very interesting to think about. But this is no different than what you may have heard of projections in a relational database, because that word is used depending on the community or technology, to produce a certain materialized view. It's really just the same thing in the event sourcing world, where we store this projected result that's been derived from a series of events, and maybe it's time limited, maybe it's just the last hour or the last few years, and we put in a read model of sorts. So that read model, and this is very interesting, is that it could be a relational database, document store, graph data. I can't even think of them anymore. Graph database. It could be files like a CSV or PDF or Excel or Google Sheets or what have you, a flat file, maybe audio. I don't know how that would work necessarily. But the possibilities go on, right? Because you're using the same core data. Maybe you need a little bit, maybe one projection, needs to leverage A, B, C, D, and E, and then another's A, B, E, F, what have you, right? But you can pick and choose. It's very cool. So projections like a materialized view, they give you that predictability because of the shape, that templating. You have an idea of what it's going to look like. The values inside may change, right? Maybe they're null and they shouldn't be. But I digress. So when you have consumers or people who are interested in the data that you've been aggregating, this is incredibly powerful. It can't be stated enough. So again, think about that adjacent software team. If they need something in a GraphQL format or XML, and then they need the same thing in JSON because the APIs are going through upgrades. I'm trying not to give specifics here, but we created a lot of projections on that project, and that event sourcing was such an awesome benefit because of that. Because you have your source of truth, you have your core data. Getting excited just thinking about event sourcing. But just to clarify, projections aren't a concept just tied to event sourcing. Again, you see them in other data platforms and whatnot. So it's not just exclusive to event sourcing. But to illustrate the point, a common example of projections in the event sourcing world, at least, are with dashboards. Producing read models for dashboards that may be updated very frequently. I mean, maybe within seconds or once a minute or hour or what have you, but you may have like an operational dashboard at your work displaying more the day-to-day activities or incidents, right? Maybe you see it flash occasionally. And then elsewhere in the building or part of a generated report or a web app, again, all these things, they could have remodels for different platforms. I can't emphasize that enough. There's an analytical dashboard, and it's focused on diving deep into historical data going back months or years. Again, an event store keeps things forever, so to speak. There's not a retention period, so you can gather all that data, and in that analytical dashboard, it could help that leadership team or executives or whomever kind of identify trends and uncover hidden insights. And in most recent years, I feel like this has to be included in the video, is that event sourcing is a great way to project data into our friends in data management and data science teams, folks that are working with AI and machine learning, ML, and they're needing vast data sets. And I mean, they're capable people. They could probably reformat these things, perhaps, maybe. I don't know. But you can effectively have a constant stream, a subscription perhaps, of this data in a format that is good for them and just feed those granular facts, again, perhaps from a certain perspective or what have you, and just have that being sent their way and they can leverage it however they need to. Incredibly powerful stuff. I hope this video helps you figure out when event sourcing may be ideal. Again, can't be illustrated enough that it's not a silver bullet, it's not a golden hammer. Nothing is, of course, but you may need to shed some existing conceptions or ideas, or your existing mental model on how you deal with data, because we've been dealing with it a certain way over the years. Event sourcing makes you think about it a little bit differently. You're recording small state changes, these facts. Ideally, you capture the context and know why these things are happening with good naming. But because you're doing it that way, you're granted these like built-in milestones and can focus on the business processes. Every process, so to speak, can be recorded. And if something breaks or stops or what have you, you have a little bit of built-in resiliency. And that's a further discussion, but you get the point because you're now building your data tools, your data access layer, as it were. Do people still call it that? Differently. And you have to think about things differently to really be able to leverage this technique. That's something I know in my experience. We didn't really embrace some of these ideas. They were a little scary and new. And it's so easy to revert back to how you were doing things. That's when I speak with teams in the future after kind of teaching them the ways of event sourcing or else consulting or whatever, sometimes I see that regression. It is challenging for sure when you learn anything new. But again, event sourcing allows so many new capabilities. Because you have a giant source of truth, you can produce so much information effectively from different perspectives, different viewpoints, and from a technical level, different formats, files, protocols, whatever. Probably using the wrong words now, but it enables so much. And you have some natural separation of concerns because event sourcing, you have these rights of facts, and then you have more of the read side. And that's just like with CQRS, which we touched upon lightly. It's orthogonal, it's not dependent on each other. But point being is you kind of get some software design concepts or approaches that uh, peer out a bit more, a little differently than you would with your traditional CRUD system where you're creating an entity and then you update a whole single field. And I think we covered that CRUD still does have a place. It just depends. So hopefully this video helps you better see when event sourcing could be a benefit for you and your team. If you have any questions, obviously get in touch. This has been Eric from Event Store.